June 15, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Philippine Sea. The horizon is not quiet. It burns. More than 500 American ships stretch across the water, their silhouettes cutting through the morning haze. Battleships open fire first. Their shells arc high, then fall onto Saipan with the force of controlled earthquakes. The island trembles. Palm trees splinter. Coral dust rises into the humid air. On the beaches below Mount Tapasho, Japanese defenders wait inside reinforced caves and bunkers. They had been told this island was part of the Empire's shield, a ring of steel and stone meant to keep the war far from Tokyo. But this morning, the shield is cracking. Thousands of U.S. Marines climb down cargo nets into landing craft. Engines roar. Waves slap against steel hulls. Above them, carrier aircraft circle with mechanical precision. More than 1,200 miles away, in Tokyo, senior officers at Imperial General Headquarters study incoming reports. Saipan is not just another island. If it falls, American B-29 bombers will stand within range of the Japanese home islands. For the first time, distance no longer feels like protection. And what is happening on Saipan is not an isolated assault, it is the visible proof of something far larger. Long before American ships appeared off Saipan, Japanese planners believed geography itself would fight on their side. For decades, imperial naval doctrine rested on a single assumption. The Pacific Ocean was vast enough to exhaust any opponent. Distance would slow an enemy advance. Supply lines would stretch thin. Morale would erode long before Japan's inner territories were threatened. This thinking shaped what became known as the Outer Defensive Perimeter. By late 1941, Japan envisioned a fortified arc stretching thousands of miles, from the Kuril Islands in the north, through Wake Island, the Marshalls, the Gilberts, the Marianas, down through the Carolines, New Guinea, and the Dutch East Indies. These island chains were not random possessions. They were stepping stones of defense. Each airfield and anchorage was intended to bleed an approaching fleet. At the heart of this doctrine was Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle concept. Japanese naval planners believed that if the United States attempted to cross the Pacific, its fleet would be weakened gradually by submarines, land-based aircraft, and attrition along the perimeter. Eventually, somewhere in the western Pacific, Japan's combined fleet would meet the exhausted American force in one climactic engagement, and destroy it. Victory would force negotiation. This strategy assumed time was Japan's ally. On December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor was meant to buy that time. 6 aircraft carriers struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet at anchor, crippling battleships and temporarily paralyzing American naval strength. In Tokyo, celebrations were measured but confident. The United States had been stunned. The outer perimeter could now be secured. And secured it was, rapidly. Within months, Japanese forces captured Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya and Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Wake Island, Guam, large portions of New Guinea. By early 1942, the Empire controlled a resource-rich territory stretching over 3.5 million square miles. Oil from the Dutch East Indies. Rubber from Malaya. Strategic airfields across Micronesia. Deepwater anchorages in Truk Lagoon. From Tokyo's perspective, the Pacific now resembled a fortified moat. American industrial power was acknowledged, but underestimated. Japanese planners believed U.S. political will might falter after heavy losses. They also assumed rebuilding a shattered Pacific fleet would take years, perhaps longer than the American public would tolerate. Yet beneath the outward expansion, cracks were already forming. Japan's industrial base was limited compared to that of the United States. In 1941, American steel production alone dwarfed Japan's entire industrial output. U.S. Shipyards could replace losses faster than Japan could repair them. Aircraft factories in California and Texas were already expanding. But in early 1942, these realities felt distant. In Tokyo, strategic maps showed a wide defensive arc. In Washington, planners were already searching for ways to leap across it. Even before the perimeter was fully fortified, events were moving in directions Japanese doctrine had not anticipated. And the first sign that the Pacific Ocean might not remain an impenetrable barrier would arrive from an unexpected direction, not from an invasion fleet, but from the sky. On April 18, 1942, 16 American B-25 bombers appeared over Tokyo. They were not launched from distant land bases. They had taken off from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, nearly 650 miles from Japan's coast. The mission, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, caused limited physical damage. Factories were struck. Fires burned briefly. Casualties were comparatively small. But the psychological effect was profound. For the first time in modern history, the Japanese home islands had been bombed by a foreign power. The Imperial Army and Navy had assured political leaders that the perimeter was secure. Yet American aircraft had crossed it, not by seizing islands first, but by projecting power directly across open ocean. Inside Japan's leadership circles, the raid was treated with urgency. Defensive resources were redirected. Plans were accelerated to extend the perimeter further east and south. The desire to eliminate American carrier forces grew stronger. That urgency helped set the stage for Midway. In June 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sought to draw the remaining U.S. carriers into battle near Midway Atoll. It was meant to restore initiative and eliminate the threat revealed by Doolittle's raid. Instead, between June 4 and June 7, Japanese naval aviation suffered catastrophic losses. For frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were sunk. Hundreds of experienced pilots were killed. Midway did not immediately destroy Japan's naval strength. But it reversed momentum. The perimeter remained vast. The empire still stretched across the Pacific. Yet the balance had shifted. American shipyards were already launching new Essex-class carriers. Aircraft production increased month by month. Training pipelines expanded. Japan, by contrast, struggled to replace veteran aviators lost at Midway and later in the Solomon Islands. From 1942 through 1943, the Pacific War became a contest of endurance. In the Solomon Islands, particularly at Guadalcanal, American forces began testing a new operational approach. Rather than attacking every stronghold, they identified key airfields and supply hubs. Control of airstrips meant control of surrounding seas. Gradually, Japanese positions became isolated rather than assaulted head-on. At the same time, another invisible force tightened around the empire, the U.S. submarine campaign. American submarines, operating across the western Pacific, targeted merchant shipping. Oil tankers, troop transports, cargo vessels, the arteries of Japan's empire, were systematically hunted. By 1943, losses mounted. By 1944, they became unsustainable. Fuel shortages began affecting training schedules and fleet mobility. The outer defensive perimeter depended not only on geography but on logistics. Garrisons scattered across thousands of miles required constant resupply. Aircraft required fuel. Ships required oil. Without secure sea lanes, distant islands transformed from defensive bastions into stranded outposts. Meanwhile, American planners refined what would become known as the island-hopping strategy. Rather than attacking heavily fortified bases like Rabaul directly, U.S. forces bypassed them. They seized strategically valuable islands instead, locations capable of supporting long-range bombers and fighter escorts. Once bypassed, Japanese garrisons were cut off, left to wither without reinforcement. In November 1943, American forces captured Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. In early 1944, they advanced into the Marshall Islands, taking Kwajalein and Eniwetok. Each victory moved U.S. airfields closer to Japan's inner defensive ring. The Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam were now in focus. These islands were not merely stepping stones. They were strategic thresholds. From the Marianas, a new American weapon, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, could reach the Japanese home islands with heavy bomb loads. Japanese planners understood this clearly. If the Marianas fell, Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka would no longer be distant industrial centers beyond reach. They would become targets. By early 1944, the Pacific Ocean no longer resembled a protective moat. It had become a corridor, increasingly controlled by American carriers, submarines, and long-range aviation. And as U.S. fleets assembled for the assault on the Marianas, Japanese leaders began confronting a reality their original doctrine had never fully prepared them for. Distance was shrinking. For generations, Japan's leaders believed insularity was security. The nation had repelled Mongol invasions in the 13th century. It had modernized rapidly in the 19th century without being colonized. Surrounded by ocean, it had cultivated a strategic culture rooted in controlled access. Water was barrier. Water was warning. Even in the early months of the Pacific War, this belief persisted. The outer defensive perimeter was not merely military planning, it was psychological assurance. Maps in Tokyo showed concentric rings of territory extending thousands of miles outward. Every captured island reinforced the image of depth. The further the empire stretched, the safer the homeland appeared. The Doolittle Raid cracked that image. Midway fractured it. But it was the steady, methodical American advance through 1943 and 1944 that dismantled it completely. Each lost island reduced perceived depth. Each bypassed stronghold exposed the vulnerability of isolation. Reports from submarine command showed merchant losses mounting. Fuel allocations tightened. Training hours were cut. For the first time, Japanese planners confronted a war where geography no longer favored the defender. American aircraft carriers did not require nearby bases to strike. Submarines operated independently for weeks. Long-range bombers extended operational reach beyond anything previously experienced in naval warfare. The ocean had changed character. It was no longer a moat. It was a highway. And that realization carried consequences far beyond tactical calculations. It eroded confidence at the highest levels of leadership, where strategy depended on assumptions that were now dissolving. If psychology was the first crack, technology was the force that widened it. In 1941, most naval aviation operated within limited range. Aircraft carriers were powerful but constrained by fuel, aircraft endurance, and maintenance cycles. Land-based bombers required forward airfields. By 1944, American engineering had transformed those limitations. The Essex-class carriers, entering service in growing numbers, carried larger air groups and operated with improved radar coordination. Fleet logistics improved dramatically. Oilers and supply ships enabled fast carrier task forces to remain at sea for extended operations. Radar-directed fighter control reduced surprise. Combat air patrols were coordinated with efficiency that Japan increasingly struggled to match. Then there was the B-29. Designed for high-altitude, long-range bombing, the Superfortress possessed a combat radius exceeding 1,500 miles with significant payload. Pressurized cabins allowed crews to operate above much of the effective anti-aircraft fire and early war interceptors. Remote-controlled defensive gun turrets reflected advanced fire control systems. The B-29 was not just an aircraft. It was a statement. It represented industrial scale, engineering depth, and logistical planning. It required massive airfields, complex maintenance crews, and enormous fuel reserves. Only a nation with overwhelming industrial capacity could deploy it in meaningful numbers. And that nation was the United States. When American planners targeted the Marianas, they were not seeking symbolic victories. They were securing launch platforms for strategic bombing. From Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, Japan's industrial heartland would lie within operational reach. Japanese intelligence recognized this. Intercepted communications and reconnaissance reports confirmed American interest in the region. Defensive reinforcements were sent. Air units were repositioned. But replacing experienced aviators lost at Midway and Guadalcanal proved difficult. Training pipelines had shortened under wartime pressure. Fuel shortages reduced flight hours. The qualitative edge narrowed. Technology was no longer merely supporting strategy. It was reshaping it. Range, production capacity, radar coordination, damage control systems, these factors combined to render traditional assumptions obsolete. And as American fleets converged on the Marianas in mid-1944, technology and geography intersected at a single decisive point, one that would test whether Japan could still defend its shrinking perimeter. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had understood the imbalance long before 1944. In 1941, he warned political leaders that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but beyond that he held no confidence in victory. He knew American industrial output would eventually outmatch Japan's capacity to replace ships, aircraft, and trained personnel. Yamamoto's death in April 1943, when his aircraft was intercepted and shot down by U.S. fighters in the Solomon Islands, removed one of the few senior leaders who openly recognized the scale of the coming struggle. By 1944, decision-making rested with leaders operating under growing constraints. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who also served as war minister for much of the conflict, faced increasing pressure from both the Army and Navy. Strategic disagreements deepened. Resources were limited. Fuel allocations became political decisions as much as military ones. The Army prioritized defense of the Philippines and Southeast Asia. The Navy argued that the Marianas represented the critical threshold. Both were correct in their own calculations. But Japan no longer possessed the material flexibility to defend every approach simultaneously. Leadership in Tokyo began confronting a harsh truth: the empire's geographic breadth had become a liability. It required dispersion of forces rather than concentration. Communication lines were long and increasingly vulnerable to submarine attack. Reinforcements often arrived too late, or not at all. In earlier stages of the war, expansion had created confidence. Now contraction created urgency. When American preparations for the Marianas invasion became clear, Japanese leaders initiated Operation Ago, a plan designed to commit remaining carrier strength in a decisive engagement. It reflected the old Kantai-Kessen doctrine, the belief that one climactic naval battle could reverse momentum. But the conditions of 1944 were not those of 1941. Japan's air groups were less experienced. Radar coverage was inferior. Pilot training hours had declined dramatically. Replacement crews lacked the combat seasoning of veterans lost in 1942 and 1943. Leadership understood the risks. Yet retreat was politically unthinkable. And so they chose to fight for the Marianas, aware that defeat there would carry consequences far beyond a single island chain. Japanese defensive planning emphasized fortified strongholds. Islands like Truk, Rabaul, and Saipan were reinforced with coastal artillery, bunkers, airfields, and cave systems carved into volcanic rock. The expectation was straightforward: force the enemy to assault directly. Inflict heavy casualties. Delay progress. Increase political cost. This doctrine had worked in earlier wars. But the American approach evolved. Rather than attacking every fortress, U.S. commanders selected targets that offered strategic value. Airfield potential, harbor access, proximity to supply lines. Heavily defended positions were bypassed, isolated, and neutralized by air and sea blockade. Rabaul, once considered an impregnable bastion, was gradually encircled and rendered irrelevant without full-scale invasion. The Japanese fortress strategy assumed the attacker would strike every node. American mobility challenged that assumption. Carrier task forces moved rapidly. Amphibious operations were supported by overwhelming naval gunfire and close air support. Seabees constructed airstrips within days of capture. Supply chains followed quickly behind. By 1944, the tempo of operations increased dramatically. Tarawa in November 1943. Kwajalein in February 1944. Eniwetok shortly after. Each assault shortened the distance between American bombers and the Marianas. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized honor, resistance, and refusal to surrender. Garrison commanders were expected to hold positions to the last. This slowed American advances but did not reverse them. Isolated garrisons consumed resources without altering strategic direction. Mobility was defeating immobility, and in the Marianas, that clash of doctrines would reach its most consequential test. By early June 1944, Japanese intelligence assessments were stark. American naval strength in the Central Pacific had grown beyond earlier estimates. Carrier numbers exceeded expectations. Submarine effectiveness had reduced merchant tonnage to dangerous levels. Fuel stockpiles were shrinking. Internal Navy reports acknowledged the declining quality of pilot training. Average flight hours for new aviators were significantly lower than pre-war standards. Aircraft production continued, but trained crews were irreplaceable at the same rate. Some officers privately questioned whether Operation Ago could succeed, yet abandoning the Marianas without decisive battle would effectively concede the approach to the home islands. Politically and psychologically, that was unacceptable. When U.S. forces began landing on Saipan on June 15, 1944, Japanese leaders understood the stakes clearly. This was not merely another defensive engagement. It was the moment when the shrinking perimeter would either stabilize, or collapse inward. And at sea, beyond the beaches of Saipan, fleets were already moving toward an encounter that would determine whether any outer shield still existed at all. June 19, 1944. 2 days after American forces landed on Saipan, the Japanese combined fleet moved to engage. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the mobile fleet, Japan's remaining carrier striking force. It included 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. On paper, it still appeared formidable. But numbers concealed fragility. Many of Ozawa's pilots were newly trained. Fuel limitations had restricted practice flights. Combat experience was scarce compared to the veterans lost at Midway, the Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz. Across the Philippine Sea, the U.S. Fifth Fleet waited under Admiral Raymond Spruance. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58. 15 fleet and light carriers, protected by modern battleships, cruisers, and a dense screen of destroyers. Radar picket ships extended early warning coverage far beyond visual range. Shortly after dawn, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft located elements of the American fleet. Ozawa launched the first wave. More than 300 carrier aircraft were dispatched in multiple strikes throughout the day. The intention was clear. Overwhelm American defenses with distance and coordination, striking from beyond the reach of immediate counterattack. But American radar detected the incoming formations long before they approached. Fighter direction officers aboard U.S. carriers guided F-6F Hellcat fighters into intercept positions with methodical precision. Pilots climbed to altitude and waited. When Japanese aircraft arrived, they encountered a layered defense. Radar warning, coordinated fighter interception, and concentrated anti-aircraft fire from dozens of ships. The imbalance became visible within hours. In wave after wave, Japanese planes were shot down before reaching effective attack range. Those that broke through faced intense anti-aircraft fire. Bombing runs were disrupted. Torpedo approaches were scattered. American pilots later described the engagement with grim understatement. The term Great Marianas Turkey Shoot entered naval vocabulary, reflecting the one-sided nature of the aerial combat. By the end of June 19, hundreds of Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. American losses were comparatively light. Yet the battle was not only in the air. That same day, U.S. submarines USS Albacore and USS Kavala penetrated screening defenses and torpedoed two major Japanese carriers, Taiho and Shokaku. Both eventually sank. Fires spread through hangar decks. Fuel vapors ignited. Damage control teams struggled to contain explosions intensified by inadequate ventilation procedures. The loss of carriers compounded the destruction of trained aviators. On June 20, American forces pursued the retreating Japanese fleet. Late in the day, Mitchell authorized a long-range strike, a calculated risk at the edge of operational range. U.S. aircraft located Ozawa's carriers and attacked at dusk, sinking the carrier Hyo and damaging others. The returning American pilots faced darkness and fuel exhaustion. Many were forced to ditch at sea. Mitchell made the unusual decision to illuminate carrier decks despite submarine risk, guiding exhausted crews home. The battle ended with Japanese naval aviation shattered. Of approximately 430 carrier aircraft committed over the 2 days, the majority were destroyed. Pilot losses were irreplaceable. The surviving carriers withdrew with severely depleted air groups. Operation Ago, intended as decisive salvation, had instead accelerated collapse. For Japan's leadership, the meaning was unmistakable. Carrier aviation had once been the spearhead of expansion at Pearl Harbor. Now it was nearly spent. And without effective carrier air power, defending the Marianas, and the shrinking perimeter beyond, became immeasurably harder. On Saipan, the fighting on land continued. But at sea, the balance of power had tipped irreversibly. While Ozawa's shattered carriers withdrew westward, the battle for Saipan intensified. June 22, 1944. American forces had secured beachheads along the island's western coast. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions pushed inland against entrenched resistance. Japanese defenders, commanded by Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito and Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, fought from prepared cave systems and concealed artillery positions. Every ridge was contested. Every ravine became a kill zone. Saipan was not defended as a temporary outpost. It was defended as a shield for the empire. Japanese high command understood the island's significance with stark clarity. At roughly 1,500 miles from Tokyo, Saipan, along with Tinian and Guam, offered what no previous American capture had provided, a stable base for long-range strategic bombing of the home islands. The B-29 Superfortress had already begun operations from bases in China earlier in 1944, but those missions required hazardous supply flights over the Himalayas. Fuel and bomb loads were limited. Operational tempo was restricted. The Marianas would change that equation completely. By late June, American naval gunfire and close air support systematically reduced organized resistance. U.S. forces advanced northward, capturing key high ground including Mount Tapasho. Japanese supply lines were severed. Communication deteriorated. On July 7, 1944, in one of the largest banzai charges of the Pacific War, thousands of Japanese soldiers launched a final assault against American lines. It was a desperate, coordinated attack intended to inflict maximum casualties before collapse. The assault overran portions of the 105th Infantry Regiment before being repelled after hours of close-quarters fighting. By July 9, organized resistance ended. More than 29,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. Thousands of civilians had also perished, many in tragic mass suicides driven by fear of occupation and propaganda that depicted American forces as brutal conquerors. American casualties were heavy, over 3,000 killed and more than 10,000 wounded, but the island was secured. In Tokyo, the political consequences were immediate. News of the Philippine Sea disaster had already shaken confidence. Confirmation of Saipan's fall struck deeper. The island was considered part of Japan's inner defensive ring. Its loss meant American heavy bombers would soon operate within direct range of the homeland. On July 18, 1944, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned along with his cabinet. The official explanation emphasized responsibility for military setbacks. Unofficially, it marked recognition that the strategic assumptions guiding Japan since 1941 had collapsed. Within weeks, American engineers, Seabees, began transforming Saipan and nearby Tinian into vast airbases. Coral was crushed and flattened into runways capable of supporting fully loaded B-29s. Fuel depots, maintenance hangars, bomb storage facilities, all rose rapidly from terrain that had been contested only days earlier. By November 24, 1944, the first B-29 raid launched from the Marianas struck Tokyo. The distance that once separated American industry from Japanese cities had narrowed to operational routine. The outer defensive perimeter no longer existed in meaningful form. Truk was bypassed. Rabaul was isolated. The Philippines were under threat. Japanese naval aviation had been crippled in the Philippine Sea. For the first time since the war began, Japan faced sustained, direct vulnerability. No island bastion stood between American air power and the industrial heart of the empire. The Pacific Ocean, once imagined as protective depth, had become a conduit for overwhelming force. And as the first superfortresses climbed from Saipan's runways toward Tokyo's skyline, Japanese leaders confronted a reality that could no longer be postponed. The war had reached home. November 1944. B-29 formations rise steadily from the runways of Saipan and Tinian. Engines roar in synchronized thunder. Each aircraft carries several tons of bombs across open ocean toward cities that, only 3 years earlier, were considered untouchable. The first raids are conducted at high altitude. Precision bombing is attempted against industrial targets, aircraft factories, steel works, engine plants. Results are mixed. High winds over Japan disrupt accuracy. Mechanical difficulties persist in early missions. But the significance lies not in perfection. It lies in repetition. Raids continue. Week after week. The home islands are now within regular striking distance. At sea, the pressure tightens further. By late 1944, the American submarine campaign has devastated Japanese merchant shipping. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies decline sharply. Tanker losses cripple fuel distribution. Without oil, ships cannot sail. Aircraft cannot train. Factories cannot operate at full capacity. Fleet exercises are curtailed. Carrier aviation, already weakened after the Philippine Sea, receives minimal flight hours. Replacement pilots arrive with insufficient preparation. The Imperial Navy, once the spearhead of expansion, becomes increasingly immobilized in harbor, preserved for a decisive engagement that grows less likely by the month. In October 1944, American forces land in the Philippines, fulfilling General Douglas MacArthur's pledge to return. The resulting Battle of Leyte Gulf becomes the largest naval engagement in history. Japanese surface forces commit remaining battleships and cruisers in complex, high-risk operations designed to disrupt American landings. The effort fails. For carriers, largely stripped of aircraft and used as decoys, are lost. Battleships and cruisers are sunk or damaged. The Imperial Navy's ability to conduct large-scale coordinated operations collapses. With the Philippines contested and sea lanes severed, Japan's southern resource area is effectively cut off. The empire fragments. Garrisons across the Pacific, from the Marshalls to New Guinea, find themselves stranded. Supplies dwindle. Reinforcement becomes impossible. American air superiority prevents meaningful resupply efforts. Meanwhile, strategic bombing shifts in method. Under Major General Curtis LeMay, B-29 tactics adapt. High-altitude daylight raids give way to low-altitude nighttime incendiary missions designed to exploit the vulnerability of densely built urban centers. Wooden structures, closely packed neighborhoods, and limited firefighting capacity amplify destruction. Japanese civil defense strains under constant alarm sirens. Industry disperses into smaller workshops in an attempt to reduce vulnerability. Production slows. Transportation networks are repeatedly damaged. Rail lines and ports are targeted to compound logistical strain. By early 1945, fuel shortages become acute. Aircraft are grounded for lack of gasoline. Naval vessels remain inactive, conserving reserves for a final homeland defense. Strategic space contracts further. Okinawa becomes the next objective. Only 350 miles from Kyushu, the island offers potential staging grounds for direct invasion of Japan itself. When American forces land there in April 1945, the proximity underscores how completely the defensive perimeter has dissolved. 3 years earlier, the empire had stretched confidently across the Pacific. Now the war presses against its own shoreline. And with every passing month, the reality becomes unavoidable. Isolation no longer protects, it confines. March 9 to 10, 1945. Just after midnight, more than 300 B-29s approach Tokyo at low altitude. They are not flying in tight daytime formations. They arrive in streams. Individual aircraft descend to roughly 5,000 to 8,000 feet, far lower than earlier missions. Their bomb bays carry incendiaries designed to ignite urban neighborhoods built largely of wood and paper. Pathfinder aircraft mark target zones. Then the fires begin. Within hours, a firestorm engulfs large sections of eastern Tokyo. Winds generated by intense heat accelerate the blaze. Entire districts are consumed. Civilian shelters collapse. Infrastructure buckles under temperatures no firefighting force can contain. By dawn, approximately 16 square miles of the capital lie devastated. Estimates suggest that around 100,000 people are killed in a single night, making it one of the deadliest air raids in history. And it is not an isolated strike. Similar incendiary attacks follow against Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of smaller industrial cities. Urban production declines sharply. Transportation networks suffer repeated disruption. Workers are displaced. Housing shortages intensify. Strategic bombing does not immediately compel surrender. But it erodes capacity, material and psychological. Meanwhile, the naval blockade tightens further. American submarines and aircraft target remaining shipping routes. By mid-1945, Japan's merchant fleet is largely destroyed. Coal distribution falters. Food imports decline. Urban rationing worsens. Fuel reserves reach critical levels. The once proud battleship Yamato, largest of its kind ever built, is dispatched in April 1945 on a one-way mission toward Okinawa. With limited fuel for return, it represents both defiance and desperation. American carrier aircraft intercept and sink it before it reaches the island. The loss symbolizes the end of Japan's blue water naval capability. Okinawa itself becomes a prolonged and brutal battle. From April to June 1945, Japanese forces mount fierce resistance. Kamikaze attacks intensify, targeting American ships with suicide aircraft. The tactic reflects diminishing alternatives, a strategy born of dwindling resources and strategic isolation. Yet even kamikaze operations cannot reverse momentum. American forces establish airfields on Okinawa. The home islands now lie within fighter escort range. Invasion planning accelerates under the codename Operation Downfall. Inside Japan, leadership debates narrow options. The Navy recognizes its incapacity to challenge American sea control. The Army prepares for homeland defense, organizing civilian militias and fortifying beaches. Industrial output continues to decline under relentless bombing and blockade. The geographic truth is unmistakable. The empire that once stretched across half the Pacific has contracted to its core islands. And even those are under constant assault. No outer ring remains. No island shield stands between American industry and Japanese cities. The realization that began with distant raids in 1942 has become inescapable by mid-1945. Modern war has erased distance as protection. The Pacific Ocean, once imagined as sanctuary, has become an open avenue of approach. By mid-1945, Japan confronted a truth that had been decades in the making. No island was beyond reach, no ocean sufficiently wide to guarantee safety. The outer defensive perimeter, once envisioned as a protective moat, had been steadily dismantled by technology, strategy, and industrial scale. From the psychological shock of the Doolittle Raid to the relentless advance through the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas, each event signaled that geography alone could not preserve an empire. Industrial capacity had become the ultimate arbiter of security. American shipyards, aircraft factories, and logistics networks projected power across thousands of miles with precision and speed that Japanese planners could neither match nor contain. Carrier aviation, submarines, and strategic bombers transformed vast oceans into highways of destruction. Islands once considered safe havens became exposed platforms from which attacks could be launched directly at the homeland. For Japanese leaders, the realization was as strategic as it was existential. Leadership, doctrine, and morale were tested under conditions where traditional assumptions failed. Tactics rooted in honor, fortress defense, and decisive battle were increasingly irrelevant. The very scale of the empire, once a source of confidence, became a liability, accelerating collapse rather than preventing it. The Pacific War had reshaped not just the map, but the meaning of distance, defense, and vulnerability. It was a war in which industrial might, technological innovation, and operational flexibility redefined what it meant to be secure. No fortress, no island, no natural barrier could shield a nation from the reach of a determined, resourceful opponent. And in that realization lies a lasting lesson: in modern warfare, geography is never absolute, and the illusion of safety can be shattered with precision, persistence, and resolve. This awareness, forged in fire, blood, and steel across the Pacific, would echo through military thinking for generations to come.